The three historical papers given at the first 1989 peer review Congress by Cronick, Burnham, and then our Elizabeth Noel have been widely quoted and seem important, at any rate to scientists interested in how we got to here with peer review. I give an introduction to Professor Fyfe simply to tell you that fact, but also to prepare you to meet a strange beast from another part of the academic forest. She has been a historian of science and technology, interested in scientific publishing particularly. She trained at Cambridge, of course. She worked in Galway for a decade and has been at St Andrews since 2011, and there she is as a professor. She focused on the mid-19th century, but she now finds herself investigating an entire 350 years of scientific journal publishing and bringing an historical perspective to help us understand why academic publishing currently works the way it does. Her talk is The Social Dynamics and Structural Bias in Peer Review, or 1865 to 1965. Professor Fyfe.
Thank you, Drummond. And I need to reacquire that. Okay, so as my title says, I'm going to be looking at the history of peer review. In fact, I'm going to be talking about the history of peer review in the century before that term even came into existence. I'm talking about a period before the 1960s and 70s when peer review as a phrase was coined. Now, of course, there was something that has some similarities to peer review before the 1960s and 70s. The practice of seeking confidential written reports from external experts had been around, well, for how long? Certainly late 18th century, early 19th century, depends what you think is important. But anyway, had been around for a while before that. So I can talk about a history of peer review before that, but I will mostly be calling it refereeing because that's the more historically accurate term. But what's really interesting for the purpose of this paper, I think, is that refereeing, as it was practiced in that earlier century, was very specifically associated with certain types of journals. It was something that was found mostly in journals published by learned societies. In other words, refereeing was a practice that was developed in the context of communities of scholars. It was not a practice that was widely used by journals run by editors, single editors, one person in charge. It's something associated with communities. So that's what I'm interested in today, that question about the communities of scholars behind refereeing and what social structures, what social dynamics, and what biases might be built in because of the nature of that community. Now, I have spent the last 4, or maybe it's 5 years of my life working on a project on the world's longest running scientific journal. It's the Philosophical Transactions, and it's been going for 350 years. Which means that I'm vastly outside my normal comfort zone looking at things that are much older than I normally look at. Anyway, my team and I have been exploring the correspondence, the committee minute books, the referee reports that still exist in the archive of the Royal Society in London. And it's an amazing archive for any of you who are at all interested in historical scientific material. Now, we're not only interested in the history of peer review, we're also interested in a range of questions about how journals were organized and managed in the past. But obviously here I'm talking about the peer review side of things. Now, most of the graphs I'm going to be sharing with you today, and I don't normally do graphs, but I have actually quite recently been doing some, I find, fascinating work with some collaborators that gives me all these graphs to talk about. So I've felt coming to this Congress that I would take the opportunity to share some of my graphs. Anyway, the graphs come from this, whoops, wrong way, hang on, from this data set. This is a series of handwritten ledgers that still survive in the Royal Society archives. It's called the Register of Papers, and you can think of it as a paper-based editorial management system. In other words, it's a record of every paper that was submitted to the Society with its title, its author, the date received, the date it was sent to referees, the names of the referees, if there were any, and the date the decision was made, and the final outcome. So you can actually glance down the right-hand page, and the column that quite often doesn't have very much in it is the names of the referees, and we'll come back to why that is in a moment. Anyway, that is a manuscript form. There's lots of data in it, and what we're working with today is 5-year samples that have been transcribed from that into a database. So I've got a whole year's worth of stuff for every 5 years between 1865 and 1965, and that's partly why the dates for my talk is as they are. But there is another reason for looking at that late 19th and early 20th century period, because it was a time of significant change and growth in the scientific community. So one of the things I'm interested in is looking at how those changes in the practice of scientific research, in the scale and scope of scientific research, how those things then affected editorial systems, including the practice of refereeing. So the first thing we see when we look at those every 5-year samples is a picture of what the growth actually looks like in terms of submissions to the Royal Society. The total bar is the number of submissions received. All the graphs in this format that you're going to see start in 1865 and end in 1965. So if you're worrying about the scale later on, if I haven't labelled them in big enough font, that's what they are. So there's growth across the first half of that. But you'll notice that it's biggest in the period, basically the 3 decades at the start of the 20th century, when we're looking at a roughly ×3 growth between about 1890 and 1930. You can recognise where the Second World War is, because that's the big dip on the right-hand side. So we've got a society that's dealing with 3 times more submissions coming in, and the society itself hasn't grown in size, which is also significant. One of the immediate effects of all this growth was that the Society's secondary journal, which was originally an abstract journal called Proceedings, was transformed into a full-blown research journal because the original transactions essentially couldn't cope with all this material. So what we're seeing is an early example of one journal spinning off a sister journal. I mean, nowadays, of course, we have plenty of examples of more than one sister journal being spun off. But this is one response to the scale of science. Another interesting thing that comes out, I think, of these early results is when we look at where those extra papers were coming from. So in the late 19th century, most of the papers being submitted were coming from members of the society, those fellows. So that's the green line. It's the upper, on the left-hand side, that's the upper line. But the big growth is really coming from submissions from outsiders, the blue line. And of course, at some point, they cross. So from that point onwards, we've got a scenario where the majority of papers being submitted are from people who are not members of the society. And that creates some interesting dynamics for the editorial process, as you will see in a little bit. So the growth is largely coming from people outside that community. So bear that in mind. So you can see why there's some increased strain on the editorial system with all these extra papers coming in. But there's actually another reason why there's a problem with the editorial system in this. And that is because... maybe I shouldn't hold it down here. The Royal Society itself also started to use refereeing more often. So although it had been doing refereeing since the 1830s, it had mostly been doing it for papers published in the transactions, the lengthy, well-illustrated and actually expensive to produce papers. They were the ones that tended to go to referees. In green on this, you see the proportion of papers that did not go to any referees at all. And you can see that that proportion declines quite dramatically over this period. So by the time we get to the 1930s, pretty much every paper submitted to the Royal Society, with a few exceptions, was going to referees. And in fact, a small number were even going to 3 or more referees, the blue ones at the top. So we've got more papers coming in, and more of them going to referees. So you can tell that means more referee reports needing to be written, and there are bundles and bundles of them in the Royal Society archive. Just so you know what they look like, you can see that they also developed in this period from being freehand written reports on the left to a standardized referee report form that was filled out. I was looking at those earlier and thinking, and I wonder if they also got shorter over this period. But since they're all in manuscript, it's kind of difficult to do, other than by my gut instinct. There were some very long reports in the early period. Later on, there are less often long reports. But unless someone's going to digitize this whole lot for me, I can't run you those figures. So, lots more reports needing to be written. And, by the way, more committee work to decide on choosing the referees and discussing their recommendations. This is all going to put a strain on the Society's editorial processes by the middle years of the 20th century. So I should, before going any further, tell you a bit about what these editorial processes actually were. So that is my schematic of what the editorial process looked like at the Society round about 1900. If you're thinking that looks complicated, I'll point out it was never designed that way. It is something that has evolved over time. When the Society took over the transactions in 1752, one of the first things it did was replace a sole editor with an editorial committee, and that's the committee of papers that you see roughly in the centre of this diagram. They felt that it would be less risk to the reputation of the Society to have a committee involved rather than one individual who could be incompetent or just ill long term. So a committee was thought to be better. But over the years, extra things accumulated to this process. So from 1830s, we've got referees helping out, and from the 1890s, we've also got disciplinary subcommittees who are providing advice on the selection of referees. And that's all the more necessary, I should say, because both the transactions and the proceedings are quite unusual journals in that they cover the full range of natural sciences. They don't cover just one specific discipline. So that does make certain challenges in the editorial process as well. It's part of the reason why it might have been difficult to have a single editor in charge of them. Anyway, looking at this, I hope you see that there's lots of stages involved in the process, and therefore lots of people involved in the process. And that's where my social dynamics come from. People, lots of people, okay? And a key point about all these people is that except for authors, who could not be fellows, everyone else involved in this editorial process is by definition a fellow of the Royal Society. So this is a closed editorial club, if you will. And that's a very specific sort of club with very particular characteristics, which I'm going to tell you more about. I'm going to specifically tell you right now about two aspects of this. One is who's in that club, and the other one is that communicator role that you see up in the top left, a kind of gatekeeper. But let's start with who's in the community. So, there's certain things we can say about the people who were doing the refereeing in the 19th century, the early 20th century. I know this is technically an earlier picture, but there are very few surviving pictures of Fellows of the Royal Society, and this is one of them. Fellows of the Royal Society, therefore referees, were all people who had demonstrated a certain level of research achievement. They were not merely active researchers, but they were at a certain point in their career. Very few of them, for instance, were under the age of 40. There were also people who, you could argue, would share a sense, we hope, of commitment, of responsibility, of loyalty to the institution to which they all belonged. There were hopefully also people, and also, because being a Fellow of the Royal Society in this period did not simply mean getting those prestigious letters, FRS, after your name. It also meant going to meetings, like the one you see here. It meant going to the annual soirees and social events. It meant doing a lot of committee work, quite likely. In other words, it meant meeting up with other Fellows of the Society. And that's significant, because it means that this is a group of people who knew each other, some of them better than others, of course, but they knew each other, be socialised in certain behaviours, whether that is about what the appropriate tone for discussion after an academic paper might be, or about what counts as interesting or good research, or indeed about how to behave in a suitably gentlemanly fashion to the ladies at the social events. But there are certain shared social characteristics of this group, because they all meet up and get to know each other. I think that's important. Now, some of these characteristics you might see as being quite valuable things for an editorial team. The fact that they have got a certain level of research competency and achievement, the fact that they are going to be loyal to the institution and that therefore they're going to be willing to write their reviews, we assume. The fact that they might share some ideas about what's worthy of being published could all help them work as an efficient editorial team, we would hope. However, you may have noticed from the picture that is up there, I hope you'll certainly notice from this picture 100 years later, there was something of a lack of diversity among the fellowship of the Royal Society. Okay? Yeah, admittedly this is just the physicists, but I'm afraid the biologists aren't that much better. Although papers could be submitted to the Royal Society by theoretically anybody, or any gender, any age, any nationality, they were being judged and decided upon by people who were generally white, male, based in Britain, and at least 40 years old, such as the gentleman in this room. And what I particularly like about this meeting of the officers in 1950 is the fact that you see the living officers there, but they're meeting under the oil portraits of their predecessors, who are similarly lacking in diversity. So given what we all know nowadays about implicit biases, you can see there might be some issues about what could be presented as a perfectly sensible solution of having expert, experienced judges making these decisions. But we imagine there may be some structural biases to setting up your editorial community in that way, particularly biases against outsiders. And there are, of course, a range of ways in which you might define outsiders here. With one of my collaborators recently, we've been looking particularly at gender, partly because that one is slightly easier to identify historically, retrospectively, though not always as easy as you might think. So we've been looking, for instance, at whether, when the Royal Society finally admitted women in 1945, the third column from the left, you can just about see some women in blue appearing. It's the first women being admitted to the society. We were looking to see, does this make some difference to the editorial practices? I think the point you should take from this graph is there were still very few women. We're looking, I've given you 1975 and 1985 just to give you a few more women. We're looking at about 30 women by that point in time. That means, fairly obviously, there were not very many female referees at the Royal Society in this period. Here's the data. Oops, sorry. I will get this working eventually. There's the data on women referees that we've managed to find in our 5-year samples. The numbers are not huge. You might be thinking that 1955 and 1965 are looking kind of healthy, but it turns out that virtually all of that is single-handedly the work of Kathleen Lonsdale, the crystallographer, who was an unusually active referee. In fact, unusual among male fellows as well as among female fellows. She did seem to do a lot of it. So very few papers by either men or women would be refereed by women, unless perhaps they were in crystallography when there were in fact 2 female fellows in that field. Now these numbers are so small that you won't be surprised that I can't do any statistical analysis of bias, acceptance or rejection bias against women. It's just not going to work. What we've been looking at instead is the tone and language in the referee reports and other editorial correspondence. And I'll just share a couple of examples that we've noted about the treatment that women received in the editorial process at the Royal Society. So for instance, it became common practice in the early 20th century that authors would be identified by their initials and surname, unless they were female, in which case they would be identified usually by their full first name, thus clearly identifying the gender of the author. But it wasn't just on the printed page. It was also happening in the referee process. You look at these referee reports, which were filled in by the Secretary of the Society when he sent them to the referees along with the manuscript, and you can very clearly see top left that Mrs. H. Ayrton is the author of that paper, and in the other one, Rosalind Franklin. So the gender is clear. In contrast, most referees' reports had initials. You can see A.G. McClellan in this, just very shortly after Rosalind Franklin's paper, and I have checked, and yes, I'm pretty confident that A.G. McClellan is male, or was until his death. So we've got referees knowing not merely who the author is, but also what gender the person is. There are also some interesting examples of the microaggressions experienced by women fellows in this whole process. Take Kathleen Lonsdale, for instance. When she was an author for the Society, then she was clearly gendered female, because she appeared as Kathleen Lonsdale, or later as Dame Kathleen, but nonetheless clearly female. When, on the other hand, she acted as a referee, she would receive the standard form from the Secretary saying, "Dear Sir," without scoring it out and correcting it. Now, so we can see ways in which women were treated differently in this process. I mean, none of it stopped some women being published, or indeed some foreigners and some junior scholars and other outsiders. What actually seems to be most significant, whether they got published by the Society, was whether they submitted in the first place. And so therefore I want to look at that second structural thing, the role of the communicator, the gatekeeping process. It was a long-standing tradition from at least the 18th century that papers would only be considered by the Society if they had been communicated by a fellow of the Society. And they could communicate on behalf of others. And as you saw from one of my earlier graphs, an increasing number of fellows were clearly doing that in the late 19th and early 20th century. But what you've got here is a system where you've got gatekeepers. And it is intentionally a system designed to work like that. It's an important filtering process for the Society, because it kept out the wrong sort of people, socially, and also the sorts of people who would submit such things as plans for perpetual motion machines, or descriptions of women giving birth to rabbits, or plans to square the circle. So gatekeeping, communicating, kept those papers out. And it was very successful. You remember that graph I showed you before? The red blocks at the top show you how many papers were not published. And it's actually a very small proportion. So over 90% of papers that had been accepted for consideration by the Society were ultimately published, because the gatekeeping, I would say, was so effective. This means that referees were generally working with an expectation that papers would be accepted. The decision was really, where shall they be published? Which of the journals shall they be published in? And could we make the paper any better? It's not really about, are we accepting it? Because we assume that it's come from another member of the Society. I probably trust that other member of the Society, so it's probably okay, roughly speaking. Of course, the problem with gatekeeping is that it might be rather too good at keeping papers out. So, for instance, I can't get the earlier figures on international location of authors. These are all 1950, 1960, 1970, but you won't be surprised that most authors were from Britain. It was, after all, a British society, and this is before the internet, so maybe that's not surprising. Women, very few of them as well. You can see just how small those numbers were. And that's despite the fact that the number of women scientists had been substantially growing since the 1890s, and despite the fact that since 1945 there were some women in the fellowship. We still don't see large numbers of women submitting to the Society. But it's not because there were rules saying women can't submit. Clearly some women did submit. Clearly some foreigners did submit. We can see this in the published papers. We've got school teachers, married women, colonial professors do all get published by the Society. The key thing here seems to be networks. Do they know somebody? Can they find somebody to submit their paper and help them through the process? So we have been trying to look at networks, and this is very early work. I'm going to show you, I'm going to show you a pretty picture. We haven't really started to analyse this yet because it's taken us quite a long time to build this network. But this is a picture of the connections between all authors, referees and communicators in the early period that I'm talking about. We will also be doing it for some other periods, but haven't got there yet. The colours are discipline. One of the things this shows quite quickly is that the Royal Society had stronger networks in certain disciplines than in other disciplines. So the green is physics, for instance, but you have to look very closely to find any geology or any botany. We can also hopefully do some analysis on where people were in the network and how that affected their chances of success. One of the early things we've done is look at insiders and outsiders, who's who. This is the same network, but close up on the physics section of it, and coloured differently to show who was already a fellow, in orange, who never became a fellow. You probably can't see them because the dots are very small and they're blue. And on the green, people who became a fellow. So in other words, you could move from being an outsider to becoming an insider. And that's quite interesting because publication was often part of the way in which you made that transition. So there's clearly some things we'll be able to do with that once we've had a little bit more time with the data. So now that you understand how this community worked, let's come back to my question about how it coped with the growth in scale. So how do we, a society that's got this very strict rule about only fellows being able to do the editorial work, and there's a limited number of those fellows, how do they cope when there's more and more papers coming in? So one thing that I see as a historian looking at this is that we seem to have a change in dynamic about the system that used to be run by fellows for fellows, or perhaps for people who were about to become fellows, changes to something that's much more like the members of an elite national body sitting in judgment on outsiders. But I haven't found anybody at the time talking about it in those terms. What I do find is people at the time complaining about this sort of thing. For mercy's sake, don't send me any more papers to referee for a long time. If I get much more heavy refereeing like this, it's goodbye to any chance of doing real scientific work myself, especially given the sort of rubbish I've had to report on lately. So we're seeing a sense that some of the fellows feel they're under strain. There's too many referee reports needing to be written, they can't cope, and it's taking up too much time. Does any of this sound familiar at all? So one of the things we've been doing with data from the register papers is trying to look at that workload. So here is the average number of referee reports written by referees at the Royal Society per year. It goes up from about 1.5 reports a year to about 2.5 reports at the far end, though it's not a particularly pretty line. Given that the rise in submissions was ×3, that's actually not as big an increase as I had expected it to be, and certainly not as much as I thought it would be from that biochemist's remark that we just saw. Part of the reason for that is that more of the fellows were doing some refereeing work. This is the size of the fellowship, with the red is how many of them did any refereeing. And you can see that an increasing proportion of the fellows were doing some refereeing. And that's partly why the average workload doesn't increase as much as we might have expected. However, the other key point is that there was a huge variation, and I'll go back to this one, huge variation between the referees who did just one report, which is most of them, and the referees who did a lot of reports, which is people like Kathleen Lonsdale and various others, people who did 8, 9, 10 reports a year rather than one. And if you look at the 90% confidence intervals on that, look at the breadth of that blue band, and you see how it gets wider as we go across. So in other words, as more people are being involved in the refereeing process, the workload is actually becoming more unevenly distributed. We're getting more people involved, but more of them are just doing one report. We've still got a small number of people who are doing a lot of the work, and they now seem to be doing even more work, which is, I think, rather curious. So, on the surface, we seem to have more people involved. It's a good thing, but it's not actually helping as much as we might have thought. So, by the time we get to those complaints from the biochemist, there were a number of criticisms of the Royal Society's entire system. Perhaps, in fact, the Royal Society should ditch this complex, convoluted, ponderous editorial system and rethink entirely. Some people thought refereeing was so old-fashioned by 1902 that it was an anachronism. Many people thought it was a cause of delay, quite rightly, I have to say, and also sometimes injustice. Other people accuse it of being conservative against new work, again with some cause, and of course the worry about the burden and whether it could be sustained. Others pointed a finger at the role of communicators, whether the communication system was still working effectively, both whether communicators were still doing their job properly, because some people thought the communicators were just being lazy and just forwarding anything, and thus the referees were having to do more work because the communicators weren't filtering out stuff. And other people worrying that perhaps there were maybe a few good scientists somewhere in the world who didn't work in the laboratory of a fellow of the Royal Society, and maybe they weren't submitting to the Society. But that wasn't until the 1970s they really started worrying about that. So you got some real worries about whether this system could continue any further. And you might just bear in mind that by the time we get to the 1950s, the post-war period, this is the rise of the commercial players in publishing. This is the rise of Pergamon Press and Elsevier and latterly Blackwell. So there's a lot of growth and expansion in scientific journals in the 1950s and 60s. And you can imagine why some of the learned societies, and not just the Royal Society incidentally, were starting to wonder what their role was in this new world. So that's also going on in the background. So perhaps unsurprisingly, there were a number of organisational changes just after the period that I've been looking at so far. So for instance, in 1968, the Society decided that you could actually have referees who were not fellows of the Society anymore. Quite a significant change for them, letting outsiders into the refereeing process. And in 1990, communicators were abolished as well, and you get direct submission to the editorial office. Oh, and also you can choose your own form of name from 1990 onwards as well. Though that was actually about those men who didn't want to be, it was Nick was the example. Could he possibly be Nicholas, or maybe even Nick, instead of having to be N? So change names. Now you could read this as demonstration that the closed, fellows-only, members-only editorial system couldn't, it had worked fine when the journals were for the fellows and by the fellows, but it couldn't work when the Society's ambition had become publishing all the best scientific research in the world, they hoped. So under tension, certainly. There is, I have to say, no evidence at all that this opening up of the editorial process was anything to do with concerns about diversity or bias or fairness. There's no evidence in the archive to support any of that. I have been looking for it. Rather, I think you have to say that the opening up of the editorial system looked more like an attempt to find a larger pool of referees to try and cope with that sense of overload and of burden. Did it work? Well, in a few more months' time, I'll have the data from 1970, 1975, 1980, and I might know the answer to that question. But what I can say already is that in terms of gender, no, it didn't, because we've actually found fewer women refereeing for the Society in the 1970s and 1980s than we did before, which is really quite odd when you consider that if the society didn't have enough women in the society, well, maybe they could look beyond. It makes one wonder if what we're seeing is, yes, we'll look beyond the walls of the society, but we're still looking for people like us when we're looking. So there's some interesting things to talk about there, though perhaps not now. So, I wrote this slide ahead of time because I had to submit it in advance. What I actually want to say now is not quite the same as that, I think. Partly because of sitting through the sessions earlier. I can understand why the Royal Society in the late 20th century opened up its pool of referees beyond the fellowship. I can understand why it removed the gatekeeping role later on. I mean, the first of those presumably helped spread that workload. The second certainly helped in attracting submissions from a wider pool. And from a modern standpoint, we surely have to be pleased that the Society was no longer, and is no longer, operating a system that gave a homogeneous group of senior white British males so much power over editorial decision-making. But I do wonder still if something has been lost with the watering down of that sense of community behind the journal. Because if you want to talk about encouraging and motivating reviewers or rewarding them, you didn't have to do that so much when they were all part of a society and they kind of all felt they had to do it as part of their duty, and you didn't need motivation in quite the same sense. And also the question of shared norms about what counts as good research and what the appropriate tone is. If you've got a group of people who are socialised to share certain norms, that has some advantages in, I suppose, what we'd now call reviewer training. But I mean, given all the discussions that are currently going on about the problems of motivating reviewers, about inequalities in the community of global reviewers, the global north doing most of the work, and what about the global south, for instance? What about all the concerns about whether reviewers behave properly during the process, which is what a lot of the discussion about open peer review is actually about? Given all those concerns, I think that, I certainly hope that this historical case study gives us some food for thought and reflection about how earlier people had to deal with some slightly similar things. So I shall stop there and have some reflection, everybody, please. Oh, and thank you to all my collaborators. Thank you.
That was terrific. Terrific. I have to stop there because the single most important thing that people like about this Congress is that it goes along smartly. So you'll just have to run Professor Fyfe down and ask her your questions yourself.
Exactly. I thought it was good timing at the end of the day.
I've been asked by Annette, well, actually ordered by Annette, to say that Amy Price and Kathleen Berryman, are there either of them here? Stand up, wave. Well, congratulations. They went to staggering lengths to get here from Texas, and they got here. All we had in Oregon was vast forest fires and so on. Tomorrow morning, there's a plenary session beginning at 8 a.m. There will be a WAMI meeting, a business meeting at 7 a.m. here. Breakfast will also be served beginning at 7 a.m. The reception begins now in the lobby and the exhibit hall. That's it.